The Ukrainians, people who were starved to death in a very calculated way by the Stalinist regime in Soviet Russia. Of course, what we consider to be for the sociologists in the room, the ideal type of a genocide, and that's the Holocaust. And more recently, in Cambodia, East Timor, Burundi, Rwanda, Bosnia, and unfortunately, currently in Africa, in the Sudan. Now, one of the most important reasons that we study the Holocaust is because it is the definitive example of genocide. Very often, Holocaust survivors will tell us that they believe we have an obligation to remember the Holocaust. But in addition to our responsibility to remember, we also have an obligation to search for explanations and understandings of the processes that led to the Holocaust and eventually do lead to genocide. It is only through understanding and action that we can hope to recognize and deter future genocides. What then is the origin of the word genocide? While attempts to destroy groups have always been a part of human history prior to the Holocaust, generally acts of mass death were described very generally with terms like mass murder or barbarism. The attempts by the international community during the 19th and 20th centuries focused on preventing war crimes and/or crimes against humanity during war. Various Hague treaties and Geneva Conventions, for example, made it an international crime to murder POWs or to indiscriminately kill or target non-combatants, meaning civilians. It is against the Geneva Convention to sink unarmed passenger ships, and instances like that. How many of you have heard the words Geneva Convention recently? Anybody want to volunteer where you've heard them? In conjunction with what? You've heard them.
I asked them, how was Bush against abortion, but he's killing people in Iraq. And they said, well, we signed to the Geneva Convention. So.
You give a perfect example. A lot of people are really uninformed about things like that. Did you ask them if they had ever heard of Abu Ghraib? Probably. Okay. You can't hear? Oh, you couldn't hear what she said. I'm sorry. She said she asked why Bush was against abortion, but was killing people in Iraq. But none of those international treaties or the Geneva Conventions mentioned genocide. There was a very simple reason for this. When the horrible scope of the Nazi extermination of the Jews became known, it was recognized as a crime without a name. The enormity of the Holocaust, the task of establishing protocols for punishing the perpetrators, and the impetus to create deterrence led to the creation of legal definitions of genocide. So here you have this horrible crime that has been committed, but there are no laws against it. Now, perhaps you've read in your text so far that there was one person who was the inspiration for the creation of the term genocide. The term was created by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish scholar of international law who framed the legal concept of genocide in 1943. Polish legal scholar. If you haven't already, it's described in your text that Lemkin was Jewish and he was born in 1901 in eastern Poland, the son of a Jewish father. In spite of this rural upbringing, his mother, herself an educated person, made sure that he received a broad education. And Lemkin received degrees from both Polish and German universities, and he also studied in France. As a legal scholar, Lemkin served in various capacities in the Polish Republic and practiced law privately until the start of World War II in 1939. In 1933, he traveled to Spain to a meeting of the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations. He had hoped to propose a ban on mass slaughter, but failed to convince the League to act. His experience with mass slaughter was as a child living in an area where Jews were often subjected to pogroms. Pogrom is a term on your terms list, and they were organized activities that went after and persecuted and very often murdered Jews in the western part of Russia. Well, he fled the German occupation of Poland in 1939 and eventually made his way to New York. Lemkin taught at both Duke and Yale universities and was even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 4 times. In 1948, the United Nations passed a resolution that called for the adoption of the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. Fortunately, Lemkin had lived long enough to see that, but he died almost pennilessly. He didn't have any money. And he died of a heart attack in 1959. Considering what we know about him now, it was very kind of bittersweet to me when I read that only 7 people attended his funeral. But there has been renewed interest in Lemkin, based on his, and most of that is based on his treatment in our text with Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. As a jurist and a Jew, Lemkin knew that a legal term was needed to describe the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, religious, national, or ethnic group. I'll repeat that for you because I think it's important. Lemkin knew that a legal term was needed to describe the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, religious, national, or ethnic group. At first, lacking a better term, he spoke of acts of barbarity, but he was not very satisfied with the term. Eventually, he came upon Plato's use of the Greek word genus for race or tribe. And then Lemkin added the suffix "side," which comes from the Latin, and it means killer or the act of killing. And in doing that, he created the term genocide. As I mentioned before he died, Lemkin was fortunate enough to witness the passage of the United Nations Assembly's Genocide Convention, which was the first human rights treaty passed by the United Nations. It's a long definition. but I think we should go through it, or at least read it. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Notice those categories. A national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mentally harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. But we need to think about eliminating or reducing the amount of genocide in the world. And this is not, although it looks that way, as legally specific as perhaps it should be. And we'll discuss a little later on why there are other definitions that scholars use. But this is the legal definition that exists today. And people who create other definitions do so because they believe, yes, we need to know when it happens, and we need to be able to punish people when it happens, but we also need to know why it occurs. I'm a sociologist, and this talk is the sociology of genocide. But I wanted to tell you that aside from it being defined legally as a crime, genocide is also the subject of research by social scientists. Scholars ask questions about the history of genocide, its dynamics and stages, and its conditions and causes. Sociology seeks to investigate, analyze, and generalize about the social phenomena connected to genocide. We're not content to just know the history, although we do need to know the history. But how does this happen? This is a social act. And what are the social components that contribute to genocide? One of the factors that sets social scientists' research on genocide apart from the investigations and definitions of legal scholars can be seen in the ways that they have defined genocide. Sociologists' definitions of genocide differ from each other, and they also differ from the definitions set by international law. So we have a lot of uncertainty for you, because the legal scholars define it one way, and the academics, for lack of a better word, define it lots of different ways. But you know that, you study in schools, and you know that there's no one definitive answer that you can hang your hat on when you study sociology. The differences occur because sociologists are attempting to construct generic analytic concepts which are different from specific laws or legal definitions. It's one matter to have fairly exact legal definitions, and quite another to create a definition that is general enough to include as many cases as possible. Perhaps you'll understand a bit better after I restate Lemkin's original definition of the term, then give you the United Nations legal definition again, and finally I begin to present the definitions of genocide that have been created by some of the most prominent social scientists and scholars of genocide. So we have Lemkin's definition, very broad. Race, killing, the act of killing a race or group, excuse me, of people. It gets a little bit more complicated when we look at the United Nations legal definition. And I would like to draw you back again to the paragraph at the top which says genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or excuse me, religious group. As I mentioned, this was passed in ratified and in force in 1951. Now let's consider some of the definitions from sociologists. Two of the most prominent sociologists who study the Holocaust are Frank Chalk and Kirk, who are prominent Canadian scholars of genocide. And they give the following definition. Genocide is a form of one-sided mass killing in which a state or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrator. Doesn't say anything about the categories of the people. It's just the general group. Bless you. The next person is Israel Charney, who's the founder of the Institute on the Holocaust and Genocide in Jerusalem. And he defines genocide as genocide in the generic sense is the mass killing of substantial numbers of human beings when not in the course of military forces of an avowed enemy under conditions of the essential defenselessness and helplessness of the victims. So he throws in this qualifier that you see that is going in there about not being part of the war, a military engagement of any kind. Now, Helen Fine has written some very, very important things about genocide, and I would call her, without a doubt, the foremost sociologist of genocide. She's also quite an activist, which has me quite in awe of her. She's the executive director of the Institute for the Study of Genocide at John Jay College. And she says that genocide is sustained, purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity directly or through the interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members. They're all different, but they're all the same, but they're all different in just slightly different ways. Now, Helen Fine points out that the UN definition is troubling, and I've read it to you a couple of times because of what Helen Fine has had to say. She points out that the UN definition is troubling because it excludes political, sexual, and other social groups. And she points out that there is a problem with the necessity of having to prove that the genocide was intended. Fine questions how one could go about establishing intent. One of the reasons that political is not in the UN definition, and also was perhaps one of the reasons that the United States did not sign this convention until the 80s, even though it was passed in early 1950s, is if you think about people who acted politically and eliminated a group of people because of politics, where might your mind go? Yes? To any war. But the refining of this is that as long as there were no non-combatants killed, it couldn't be genocide. Now remember the elements in here. The United States, politics, and genocide. Democrats kill the Republicans? No. Let's go back a little farther. Yes?
Maybe the Red Scare with the destroying people's careers.
Yeah, but genocide is more than destroying careers. It's, Michelle? Native Americans. And they got reinforcement for not including that, political, from another member of the Security Council who was also actively involved in genocide. Does anybody know who that might be? The Soviet Union. Remember I said that there was a genocide in the Ukraine? Stalin starved the Ukrainians to death, took all of their grain and left very little for them. It was widespread famine in the late 20s and 30s. And it was directly a political act because they always opposed the communist regime. So that's one of the problems that Helen Fine has, is that it doesn't, the UN definition doesn't include everything. Fine maintains that the legal definition of genocide has also been stretched rhetorically and is often used as a political labeling device. Today, she says, the term genocide may refer to anything from abortion to bisexuality, to cocaine addiction, and to dieting. She said she's even heard the term genocide applied to tuition increases in the contemporary press. Well, it's bad, but it's not that bad, right? What do you, I mean, when you hear genocide, I know students don't always have the time to stay up on things politically, but have you heard the term genocide applied in a place that, given what I've been talking about, might seem to you to be unusual or inappropriate? I think according to the definitions that we have, what do you think? Do you think the internment of Japanese Americans during the war could be considered a genocide? Yes?
They were at least deterring their practice of culture, so that was genocide.
By denying them the right to have their own culture and basically secluding them from other people.
It doesn't seem like we were trying to destroy them, though, or destroy their group or their ability to practice their culture.
we took all the stuff from them. I mean, we just removed them from their homes and kept.
I think it is. We basically told them what they were going to do later and forced them to
You need to speak up so that everybody can.
We forced them to sell their businesses, get rid of all their possessions. They were transported to places I think they didn't know where they were going, and I think it was genocide. We didn't kill them, but people were interned after the war was even over, and I think it was basically on their mind.
So if we think about genocide as a series of acts, a continuum, how do you compare that to something like the Holocaust or Rwanda?
Well, I was thinking, with like what we did with interning the Japanese, it goes on the like part B of the definition, but I think it shouldn't be called genocide. I think there should be something below, because it's definitely in like taking away property, putting them within a group, excluding them, taking away everything that they own, any chance of communicating with others. But the mass killing, I know torturing, things of that nature, but not to the degree that the Holocaust or what's seen in Rwanda. So I don't think genocide is the right word, but definitely something close to it. And that's where there's kind of a problem with lack of language.
Genocide came from the mass killing.
William asked whether doesn't genocide pertain to the mass killing.
Having done some very recent reading about this, some of the conditions initially in the camps were very hostile. People were out in the high desert initially without appropriate clothing. And people who were physically vulnerable didn't do all that well. Pregnant mothers, babies, some of the elder members of the community didn't survive, but I'm not sure we could say there was an intention to kill the entire group as a whole or to prevent it from replicating in any way. And so I think it's, as I think you say, it's something perhaps short of genocide, but we can argue it's part perhaps of a continuum.
Yeah, I would say, from what I know, that it destroyed many, many lives forever, even though the people physically survived, but it destroyed their livelihood and their careers. And you can hear that today when we talk to people who experience that. So it would be like, it could have been a step towards it, but luckily people survived, but often only physically, not psychologically or materially. So those are things to watch, that it doesn't get worse. You know, something like that happens, it's already wrong.
What I had thought of in terms of the United States was, of course, the Native Americans. Have any of you taken Ed Castillo's Native American class? He talks about and has mentioned in this room, this is not his year to make his lecture on Native American experience, but has there been anything that you've learned, Thedore, that might be an instance of genocide?
Well, I don't know if it was, to me it seemed indirect about how some people from Europe came over and were asking Indians to kill all their animals and use the fur for trading, and then they, depleted the resources and had no food, and then they were forced to use the stores to trade and getting their and sometimes they couldn't. So just changing their whole way of life, I think there's a huge impact.
Summarize that. Could you summarize that? I don't think we heard it down.
Essentially, Thedore is saying that the white settlers destroyed their way of life took away a great deal of their culture, etc., and destroyed the way they existed. They were, I don't know how many of you, yes?
Wounded Knee.
Wounded Knee.
Well, we call it a battle, but it was really a massacre. Like thousands of Native Americans were killed. I think almost 80 of the Europeans.
I was also going to say for this definition under E, would it be considered forcibly transferring the children when they would take the Indian children out of their tribes and just white families would take them for their own with no remorse?
Well, not just taking them for their own, but kind of
changing them into how they wanted to be.
Yes.
I think a really good example referring to Native Americans was the forced migration of several tribes from Florida to Georgia to, I believe it was Texas.
And
Only to relocating them to a place where they did not know how to survive. And over half the tribe died in the forced march.
Systematic, unsettling, and removing Native Americans from their way of life in the places they can live. Yes.
We experienced a large cultural loss too because all the elders had the oral histories of their tribes and various rituals, spiritual rituals for things. When they died, there was no one to remember the language or rituals. So nowadays, a lot of the rites that would usually take place in tribes, they have no idea how to perform certain dances and rituals and stuff like that.
So their ritual practices were also unique. I know most of you are probably born in California, and I hope some of you have been outside of California. How many of you have ever heard the name Amherst? It's a school. Some of you might have friends or relatives back east. It's a college. It's named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst. I believe the school fight song says that Lord Jeffrey Amherst was a soldier of the king. He's been implicated, and there is proof in contemporaneous documents of taking blankets and infecting them with smallpox and giving them out to Indian tribes. In my way of thinking, from what I do know, that sounds to me like biological or chemical warfare, doesn't it? And yet it happened in the 17th century. So that was one of the reasons that the Americans who were at the convention were not really eager to ratify the convention because they felt as though they could be prosecuted under it. And I had it in my notes and then took it out. But I believe the United States did not ratify this treaty, the Convention on Genocide, until 1980. Well, I know a Democrat was in the office. So it was in the late 1980s. You can see how we're having some difficulty placing something as absolutely being genocide or not. The depth of our knowledge of genocide depends fundamentally on the clarity and the significance of our definition of concepts. And as you can see, there has been some hair splitting here, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Ilke has brought up that for Japanese Americans, many of them were crushed by their experience, and though they continued to live on, many of them were psychologically managed. Does that constitute an act of genocide? Legal scholars wrangle with that all the time. As sociologists, it is important that our definitions reflect real-world behaviors, and that we can clearly distinguish events from each other. So now I have to move ahead here. Now, Frank Chalk and Carl Jonasson have categorized genocide into what they call a typology. A typology is nothing more than a classification scheme, a way of organizing information that makes it more logical. And the elements of their typology includes 4 types of genocide. The first is to eliminate a real or potential threat, actions that are taken to supposedly eliminate a real or an imagined potential threat. The second, genocides that are carried out to terrorize real or possibly potential enemies. 3, a genocide to acquire economic wealth. One might think that the actions towards the Native Americans might fall under that classification, because it was very important that the settlers got the land that they wanted and needed. And 4, to implement a belief, a theory, or an ideology. Genocide that is carried out because the perpetrators have an ideology that justifies and also demands it. The first one, genocide to eliminate a real or potential threat. And this is very possibly the oldest form of genocide. And it began with the development of agriculture and settlement, and it was very common in antiquity. Examples include the destruction of Carthage, the destruction of the Hurons of Canada, the Hutu of Burundi, and the Bangladeshis in Pakistan. Do we have any history majors? The second is genocide to terrorize real or potential enemies. And this requires large armies and investment in occupation. And the examples are the terror of Genghis Khan, Athens' murder of the men of Milos, Shaka Zulu's empire, and the Soviet manufactured famine in the Ukraine, which I talked about. The third is genocide to acquire economic wealth. And this type probably developed in antiquity. In the modern era, it's been associated with the settlement of the New World and with European colonization. Examples include the Pequots of New England and the Hereros of Southwest Africa. Have any of you ever heard of the Hereros? This was, interestingly enough, a genocide committed by the German colonists in Africa. And just last year, the German government issued an apology for their part in the genocide of the Herero people. The fourth genocide is the one that seems to characterize the modern age. And it is genocide to implement a belief, a theory, or an ideology. And this type of genocide is more recent in origin. It differs from the first 3 in that the primary victims are usually members of the perpetrator state. They actually live in the same place as the perpetrators. This is often carried out at a great cost to the perpetrators as well. And examples include the Turkish massacre of Armenians, the Holocaust, something that you will be learning about on March 1st, the Cambodian genocide under the Pol Pot regime. On March 1st, Luong Ung will speak. She's a survivor of the Cambodian genocide. Not too far in age from you. She was quite a young girl when it happened, and she's written a book. And the name of the book is First They Killed My Father. The native peoples of the Americas were reduced during the period of Spanish colonization in the South and by other European settlers in the North. And so a population of 80 million in 1492 had diminished to 3.2 million by 1750. I have to point out, because it's not on anybody's radar, certainly not the press, and the only people who know about it are people who are eager to understand genocide, that genocide continues among the indigenous people of Central and South America to this day. In order to have meat for those fast food hamburgers, land is being cleared in the South, especially in South America, at an absolutely alarming rate, clear cut. And the people who've lived in those areas for hundreds of thousands of years are being forced off their land and forced into ways of life that they don't particularly take to very well. I get an email, I'm on an email list called Genocide Watch. And it has stunned me to find out that that same process is beginning to happen in East Africa. How many of you ever heard of Bushmen? Have you ever heard that term? Bushmen are being pushed off of their land. You probably didn't hear about it, but they brought a group of them to Hollywood because they're very striking people. They're very small. And they felt that if they came to Hollywood and got some publicity, that someone would hear their plea and stop the governments of East Africa from stealing their land. So genocide is happening right here and right now, and I'll have some more to say about that. Yes? Dodoria, I can't hear.
Sorry, I think there was a movie that the Bushmen did. I think it was called something like The Sky is Falling.
God must be crazy.
God must be crazy.
Yeah, that's the one.
The Sky is Falling. Has anybody seen that? You saw it? What was it about?
Was that the one with the Coke bottle? Yeah. See, that's what. Yeah,
That's the God must be crazy.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong.
That's kind of entertainment, to let us understand how much more, modern we are. I don't think it was that one. This is not. That was meant to be kind of whimsical. What's happening to the Bushmen is not whimsical. So let's talk about sociological contributions to our understanding of genocide. Much as I would like to present some sort of unified ideas about how sociology approaches genocide, I can't do that because none exists. What I can do in this short time is to discuss 3 or 4 aspects of genocide that can be framed within an analysis of the Holocaust. These examples help to explain the larger social processes involved in the development and the practice of genocide. Sociologist and Holocaust survivor Jack Porter has developed a theory of genocidal processes. And what is meant by that is, what goes on? What's the process that goes on? Genocide, according to Porter, involves four major components: ideology, technology, actually it's four, bureaucracy and organization, and then the social disintegration of the victims. And I'll explain more in a minute. Understanding the disintegration of the victims of the Holocaust is very important for your understanding of how it happened. Now, we saw The Longest Hatred, which explained to you how centuries-long anti-Semitism contributed to people's understanding of the worth of Jews, but it also contributed to people's willingness to disintegrate the Jews from their societies. And you must always keep in mind that although we look at Germany as once again the ideal type of where this happened, it happened all over Europe. The Germans were not the only ones, although they were the instigators, who were active in this process of disintegration. The first element is ideology. And I've defined it as a belief system. Do we have any ideologies that we follow every day? Can you think of an ideology that frames your own life? Land of the free, home of the brave. There are religious ideologies. I'm thinking more about politics, though. Capitalism is an ideology. Do we live under an ideology that says that if you're not a success, it's your fault? Individualism is an ideology. It's a belief system. It kind of formulates how you think about the world. Some people say that it's very often a myth system, which means it's made out of not the truth, but just a myth. Like, it's a myth that if you work hard, study hard, apply yourself, you'll get an A in this class. Is that a myth? Is it a myth?
Some of the time.
Some of the time it is.
Depends on the standards of the person determining the aim.
Okay. All right, I want to be serious now again. So ideology is a belief system. It's used to justify and legitimize discriminatory acts against victims. And anti-Semitism is probably the ideology that connects the most closely with what you've been studying. And you know a bit about anti-Semitism now that you've watched The Longest Hatred and read some of Bergen. In the case of the Holocaust, the perpetrators utilized anti-Semitism or an ideology to justify the elimination and murder of their victims. An ideology based on racial, religious, political, or economic justifications serves to legitimize any act, regardless how dreadful. You're probably just beginning to get some sense of how the Nazis used ideology to justify the things that they did. Propaganda is used to spread the ideology, and it defines the victim as being outside of the pale of human existence. This propaganda was used to say that Jews are not the same as the rest of us. By eroding their position in the society, the members of the subject group become vulnerable to attack. And using propaganda reduces the victim to the level of non-human, thus making it easier to annihilate them. And that's exactly what happened in the Holocaust. It's exactly what happened in Rwanda. It's exactly what's happening in the Darfur region of the Sudan as we stand here today. Now, Helen Fine, our friend, using theoretical ideas from that famous Frenchman, Émile Durkheim, and his theories, describes how important placing the victim outside the sanctified universe of moral obligation is to the process of genocide. And this is, if nothing else, if you don't take this away today, I consider it one of the most important things that you'll learn in this course. What is the universe of obligation? Can you see it? The universe of moral obligation is that circle of persons toward whom obligations are owed. Who are you obliged to? To whom the rules apply. Who do you have to treat fairly? Who do you have to treat decently? And whose injuries call for attention and healing. The moral obligation to include people and to attend to their needs and their suffering if necessary. So you might think just a bit about who is in that circle of moral obligation for you. Yes?
On the previous page, the things that for another victims, and
It's not who you owe money to. It's not who you owe a Christmas present to. Who is it that you owe moral obligations to?
yourself and your community.
Yourself? You have a moral obligation to yourself and your community. Can you tell me a little bit more
The
about
group
it?
of people with which you most identify and feel connectivity to?
The people who you feel the most connected to? Yes?
All people.
All people?
All creatures.
Humanity.
Humanity? Anybody want to come in?
Your family, your friends, religion.
Religion?
The planet.
Okay.
Work.
Yep. The poor.
Poor.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I see a problem in the definition of, it would seem to me that we all have personal universes of moral obligations that require us to act, and people beyond that, we may not act. But in a world that is still racist and anti-Semitic, amongst other things, it doesn't just take the ideology of a perpetrator of genocide. They are aided by the hate that already exists in the society.
But if you hate, you have drawn a line around who you are obliged. And the question is met. Who? Who would you protect? Children?
The disabled.
The disabled?
Martin, are you suggesting that in a way propaganda can have an effect? I think this is part of Lori's question, about who we consider to be in that circle. That if we start hearing the propaganda about the poor are poor because they're not working hard enough, or people of particular religion are outside the pale, which comes from interesting sense of geography of Russia, are outside of the pale of civilization, outside the place where people are allowed to live, then we really don't need to be responsible for them. But propaganda plays such an important role in helping us determine who's in that circle.
Right. It's this interplay between action and ideology. Are there any groups that are pushed out of this circle recently or forever? Yes.
A lot of like immigrants, if they're like Hispanic immigrants in this area, they're really pushed out from the 80s, like anti-immigration rhetoric and all the laws that we passed to not allow them to incorporate in our society.
Michelle?
People who are in jail or prison.
People who are in prison? Yes.
There was just some propaganda last night on the news about the homeless leaving San Francisco.
The homeless.
Yeah, and then they said it wasn't true, but they were trying to say that they all.
Is it all that? I mean, I'm sure we can all think of excuses why. But when push comes to shove, the decision about who is in that circle can be quite magnanimous. But in other times and in other places, making a decision about who might be in that circle or that universe had some really hard places for people. And we'll talk about how people reacted to this notion that not everybody fit into the universe. It's obviously easier to commit genocide or to turn your back on someone's pain if you do not believe that you are obligated to them in any way. The second factor that Porter talked about was technology. In the case of the Holocaust, once the victim was labeled by the prevailing propaganda or ideology, and ideology shoved them outside of the universe of obligation, the killing could take place. The technology of death has become more efficient as modern nation states have become more technologically sophisticated. While clubs, machetes, gun butts, primitive weapons like that have been used in places like Rwanda and Cambodia, one of the characteristics that marked the Holocaust was the Nazis' use of sophisticated modern technology. It was technology in the service of death. And when you read some of the more detailed things about the technology that was used and the people who created the technology, you begin to get very fearful about any technology. But we don't have to worry about that anymore, do we?
We don't have any drones.
I mean, if I say to you WMD, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I just said the facade, the reason, the why.
Yeah, but they're real. There are weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, we're studying right now, our invading of Iraq, and that was what we were told.
Right. Yeah, but they still exist, so we may have most of them. So. The next thing is bureaucracy and organization. As sociologists, we study a lot about bureaucracy. Who is the sociological theorist who is most associated with bureaucracy? Who? No, not Marx. One of those dead Germans, though. Max Weber. The bureaucrats. This is Adolf Eichmann. He was the bureaucrat who said, okay, next week we're going to deport all of the Jews from France. And his little underlings in the bureaucracy and in the German railway system and places all along the line said, okay, how many trains will we need? How many people do we need to pack into one railroad car? Without thinking. I've seen someone who worked for the German railroad, the people who sent the cars filled with Jews east and that came back empty, say, to a question about, well, what did you think was going on? Say, it was really not my business to question what was going on. My job was to send the trains east. Mindless work without thought of the consequences. We see it around us all day, especially here. At least I do. There was an enormous state bureaucracy that was required to carry out genocide in Germany and in the conquered territories. But just as technology has gotten more sophisticated, so too have organizational and logistical skills. Someone's tuning their jingle bells. Just as technology has become more sophisticated, I said, got distracted, so too have organizational and logistical skills. And sociologists, who are very interested in bureaucracies and their effect on all kinds of action, have demonstrated that modern premeditated genocide must first be recognized as organized state murder, and that it often requires a complex bureaucracy. And this man, who eventually escaped after the war was over to Argentina and was captured by Israeli agents, brought back to Jerusalem and tried for his crimes and eventually murdered, is the prototypical bureaucrat of genocide. Now, new students of the Holocaust are often puzzled by the seemingly ease with which the Jews of Europe were turned into victims. As beginning learners about the Holocaust, they often find it difficult to understand the gradual, calculating nature of the victimization of the European Jews. I hope you're getting some sense of it by reading Doris Bergen. But there were 4 stages which characterized how Jews were victimized. And this was generally the way this went in Germany, and you'll read about things. The first thing was that there was a definition of who was a Jew. If you're going to, in one way or another, take care of people, you need to know who they are. You'll read about the Nuremberg laws, which defined, among other things, who was a Jew. The second thing was that Jews were stripped of their livelihoods and possessions. Part of the laws that the Nazis passed after coming to power made it illegal to practice medicine, made it illegal to practice law, made it illegal to be a civil servant, and then they also began appropriating Jewish wealth. Everybody had to turn in their fur coats so that the soldiers on the Eastern Front could be worn, the ones fighting in the winters in Russia, on the Russian front. Everybody had to turn in their radios. Everyone had to turn in their watches, their jewelry, forfeit their bank accounts. The third step was that Jews were segregated from the larger populations. They were either sent to Poland, and once in Poland, they were in ghettos, work camps, eventually concentration camps, and then in death camps. So they were isolated from the rest of society, and then finally they were sent, as I said, to concentration camps and eventually killed in death camps or died of starvation or exhaustion. This social disintegration is a description of the gradual process of removing Jews from the universe of obligation. First, you say you don't belong. Then you say you're not entitled to have the means to have subsistence. Then you say, and in fact, we're going to physically separate you. You have to go somewhere else. And fourth, you are subjected to erasure from the planet. It was an easier task to do this in some places than in others. But we know that the success of the Nazi entrapment depended on how isolated and disconnected the Jews were from the larger community. Helen Fine, in a book with a very strange title called Accounting for Genocide, found that the majority of Jews who evaded deportation, who were able to get away and not be deported to the death camps, lived in countries where the head of the dominant church in that country spoke out publicly against deportation before or as soon as it began. Denmark, Bulgaria, all too few places. Now, additional areas of sociological study have included attempts to understand the action of perpetrators, The victims, obviously, we have an obligation to understand their experience first. But also rescuers, those people who were unwilling to shrink their universe of moral obligation, and the bystanders. There's an excellent analysis of the social processes attendant to individual and group participation in mass murder during the Holocaust. That was done by Christopher Browning, where he wrote a book about ordinary men. And it is about some ordinary men who were sent away from their ordinary homes and their ordinary villages to ordinary areas of Poland, and were given the ordinary task of murdering people face to face over long periods of time. Browning summarizes the social psychological research about the perpetrators of genocide. Many of the killers of Jews were not selected because they were considered particularly suitable for the task. You will learn that the social conditions and peer pressure. Every time I say peer pressure, I want you to think back to junior high. That the social conditions and the peer pressure that the men were placed under were sufficient to provoke genocidal behavior in them. How many of you have seen Milgram experiment? Zimbardo's prison experiment? Those were conditions that were supposed to reproduce what people in the Nazis supposedly subjected that killers were subjected to, that reproduced the conditions of compliance with murder. So there were these conditions of peer pressure, social conditions, and one of the things he concludes is that years of being submitted to anti-Semitic ideology made what they had to do that much easier. Justification. Nobody, most overwhelming majority of people would think twice about murdering somebody, but if in your mind you could say, well, you know, I learned in school that these people, if we don't kill them, they're going to take everything away from us, is a way of justifying your behavior. Browning says, the collective behavior of Reserve Battalion 101 has deeply disturbing implications. There are many societies afflicted by the traditions of racism and caught in the siege mentality of war or the threat of war. I really would like you to listen to this. There are many societies afflicted by the traditions of racism and caught in the siege mentality of war or the threat of war. Everywhere society conditions people to respect and defer to authority, and indeed could scarcely function otherwise. Everywhere people see career advancement, in every modern society, the complexity of life and the resulting bureaucratization and specialization give a person a sense of responsibility of implementing official policies. You know, that's just the way it's supposed to be. I have to implement the policy. Within virtually every social collective, the peer group exerts tremendous pressures on behavior and sets moral standards. It also sets moral norms. If the men of Reserve Battalion 101 could become killers under such circumstances, what group of men and or women could not? These are the perpetrators, the top level perpetrators. The decision makers. The man in the middle is Himmler. The man on the bottom is Heydrich. There were the desk murderers like Adolf Eichmann. And then there were the willing executioners like Reserve Battalion 101, who shot people face to face, one-on-one. And, of course, Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. And then there were people like that. This is Knut Dybe. He lives not too far from here. He's getting kind of frail these days. He was named a righteous person by Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Authority, and he helped Jews in Denmark flee to Sweden to safety. And there were righteous people from every European country, as well as Japan, that have been honored as righteous people. So there were perpetrators during the Holocaust, but there were also people like Dybe, who I say did not shrink their understanding of their universe of obligation. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the victims and to tell you that over 1 million Jewish children were murdered. This is another thing that characterized the Holocaust, and that was in the past when two armies were at war, women and children were not considered fair game. But in the Holocaust, that was entirely different. Over 1 million Jewish children were murdered. The Nazis' victims, as you know, or probably have heard, included Jehovah's Witnesses, Poles, Russian prisoners of war, homosexuals, Romani and Sinti, which is the correct term for people who are sometimes referred to as gypsies, political opponents, communists, and countless others. And as you know from your readings, the first victims of the Nazis were who? Someone speak up nicely. The disabled. Germans, disabled. And then there were the bystanders. The people in countries who stood and watched. It's generous to say that they were ordinary people who played it safe. As private citizens, they complied with the law, tried to avoid any kind of harming of people, but they wanted to get on with their daily lives. And during the war, the collective world's response, we'll read about what America's response to what was going on was. And we'll see that our whole nation was a nation of largely bystanders. But I imagine that's where most of us would be, won't you? Don't want to get in, harm your family, or it takes a lot of bravery to stand up against this kind of thing. And unfortunately, in our society, we are conditioned to be even more, shall we say, in a very large bystanding mode. Your text, A Problem from Hell, focuses on American responses to genocides during the 20th century. Recently in Time magazine, Samantha Power suggested that since the invention of the word genocide, a long line of presidents have gone out of their way to avoid using the word. Jimmy Carter resisted branding the Khmer Rouge with the term. Ronald Reagan avoided applying it to Saddam Hussein. The first President Bush refused to apply it to the Bosnian Serbs. And Bill Clinton skirted the label for Bosnia and Rwanda. State Department spokeswoman Christine Shelley became the face of Bill Clinton's semantic wiggle when she tried to insist that, although hundreds of thousands of Rwandans had been butchered, only acts of genocide were occurring. The horrors in Darfur, the Darfur region of Sudan, are just what Lemkin had in mind when he developed the term genocide. Sudan's government and its Janjaweed militias are systematically expelling Darfur's non-Arab population. They are murdering tens of thousands and permitting widespread gang rape to make what they say will be lighter-skinned bodies and ensure that non-Arab tribes will be too degraded to return to their homes. According to words that Samantha Powers has written in a recent issue of Time magazine, one of which display in the Soch corridor focuses in on what's going on in Sudan. The Bush administration is using the G word, but the U.S. use of the G word, they are actually saying what's going on in Darfur is genocide. They're actually saying the word. But all their uttering of the G word has done is to set off another round of bureaucratic shuffling. And Power says the Bush administration officials seem to feel that, having used the G word, they have done their part. But the sin of the past presidents is not that they failed to use the word, but that then, as now, they failed to stop the crime. So genocide is with us. It is not a term that belongs in the history books. Every year we have a lecture that is named after perhaps the most important person in establishing the Holocaust lecture series, Robert Harris. And every year we have a Robert Harris lecture, and this year the speaker will be Jerry Fowler, who's been here before. He is the director of the Committee on Conscience for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and he has been very active, traveling all over the world, trying to use what influence the Holocaust Museum has to prevent what's going on in the Sudan. And he's going to come and speak with us on, I believe, March 22nd. Barbara believes that, I believe it too, so it must be right. Unfortunately, I leave you with a world filled with genocide. I wish I could say, you know, it's in the past and it's all over, but I can't. I hope by raising your awareness of this issue, things may change. I also, once again, want to commend you for coming in here and spending a gloomy day on a gloomy subject, but you now carry something with you that in the long run will change you and I hope make you a better person. Yes?
Can you call genocide on a micro level, how the Iranian conflict of how our government was contacted with Iran and allowing them to import crack into our ghettos, and in turn crack kills people.
Hannah wanted to know whether I think on a micro level, something that you may not know about which occurred during the Iran Conference that we found out about, which was that government functionaries actually developed and brought in crack cocaine and began selling it in South and Central LA in order to find profits to finance their covert actions. And I would say that it is one more step in the process that does not recognize the value of everybody in this society and says, sure, let's go and use racist, just in its conception, if not in its practice. Genocide, small group of functionaries doing it. For me, it's when the power of the government is put behind the forces that do this. I guess, yeah, I'm going to talk. But most people don't know that that happens. And the terror effects that it has on the community and
And the person who brought it out in the San Jose News